Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, the show where I, Gooey, rank all of the dungeons in The Legend of Zelda. And for this season, we're also with Corey Richmond. How's it going, Corey?
It's going good.
And we're continuing through Wind Waker. This week, we're taking a look at our second, proper dungeon, Forbidden Woods. We're here to rescue Makar. He's one of the Koroks that resides in the Forest Haven, so that we can receive Farore's Pearl, which is a key item in our quest to defeat Ganon. And like Dragon Roost Cavern, I feel that this dungeon also has a nice little slot that it fits into in this world. Both it and Forest Haven, they sort of look like these, giant trees that sit atop the Great Sea. But the Forbidden Woods itself is covered with, these prickly giant vines. And that's, what requires us to float in precariously to reach the dungeon. And that theme sort of carries over inside the dungeon with, all these thorn vines that'll grab you and the morphs and stuff like that stick to you. Even when Ganondorf needs to send his minions in after you, they have to get, airlifted in. It is sort of this prickly, precarious dungeon. Of course, the dungeon itself, it takes a few cues from inside the Great Deku Tree, because it gives you the kind of this big, large, central room that makes you feel like, you're navigating inside this large tree or wooded area. The musical track, it kind of goes with this vibe, giving you this feeling like something's lurking in the grass.
It feels very alive almost. I don't know if there's particle effects in the air or everything's got kind of a soft look, like soft lighting, and almost there's a haze over some stuff. And what I really like that I noticed more so on this playthrough than I have in the past, and it also might be something that the HD version kind of helped vamp up, is that there are a few parts where you can see openings of the hollowed out tree that you're in, and you can kind of see, parts of the sky or big pits below. And
yeah, the scale there is for sure. You eventually get to the bottom floor of it, which is mostly filled with water, which kind of does give you the impression that you're, more at the base of the tree where it grows out of the sea. And there's even some Octoroks down there. And I thought that was cool. That reminded me a little bit of a Snowhead in Majora's Mask, where it's this icy type region, but then you kind of get down below and there's more magma, once you're within the surface level area.
That's something that I think is a big strength of this dungeon, is that you walk into a room and it's not just four walls and a door ahead of you or a puzzle ahead of you. You walk into a room and it's there's an entire floor below you that you could jump down to, or there's a path going up. The Baba Buds can shoot you up, and you can Deku Leaf everywhere. And the Deku Leaf is absolutely essential in navigating this place.
And that brings us perfectly to what I wanted to talk about, which is the gameplay and puzzle perspective of this dungeon. I think we see a continuity here with not just the previous dungeon, but also those platforming sections in the last episode we were talking about in the Forest Haven. There's the Deku Flower and the Leaf, and there's stuff that uses those in different forms, but the standout puzzle for me are the ones that are centered around those eyeballs that grow on the doors. That's the new thing kind of implemented here. They grow the vines that prevent you from just going through the door, and you can't just attack them with the sword. They'll close if you get near them. It sets up all these different situations where you have to try something different to destroy them, whether it's a bomb, a lit Deku stick, or the best example is all the puzzles they do using those large nuts. Do you know what those are called?
No. Is there an official name for them?
Bako nuts. So you have to use these Bako nuts to throw them at the eyes and destroy them. The nuts themselves are this ever-evolving puzzle, so you have to find different ways to obtain them or transport them that keep changing up in, I think, pretty clever ways, and it encourages you to try out different strategies and solutions, and it feels very organic.
One of the first notes that I had on this dungeon is that the way that the puzzles, specifically like you said, the eyeball puzzles and the Bako nut puzzles, the way that those evolve throughout the dungeon, I was just completely impressed with. I love that they present you with something literally in the first room. You got a Bako nut puzzle combined with one of the eyeball puzzles, and then it's from there, okay, you know this information, you know how these work, so let's give you just one extra layer of challenge that you need to figure out. Like this one, oh, there's no Bako nuts around, but what do I have at my disposal? There's a Deku stick and there's a lit torch. And then of course later on you get to the ones where there's 2 eyeballs on the door, and at that point it's like, okay, well I clearly need to find some other solution as well. There is a dungeon item in this dungeon, but besides the puzzles that involve that, I feel like this dungeon, one of its main items is almost the Deku leaf. Not only in the navigation, but in the puzzles themselves too. Besides just floating around and jumping out of the Boko buds and stuff, you use them to blow the different little platforms back and forth and blow the little propellers. And then there's one really good puzzle with a Bako nut where you can't quite get to it because if you approach it, the vines pop up and you need to blow it out of the circle so that you have access to it. That's such a great puzzle.
All these elements, they do a good job of like interweaving them. Like we're going to use the vines here in combination with the leaf, and then like later you use the vines, but it's like just to like get around them. But that room has like the barriers you need to blow up the bombs. So I like that, continuing the continuity of the puzzles from the previous dungeons too, using what you know about these gameplay items or elements to like, you know, keep evolving the puzzles, and I think that's really cool. So you mentioned the 2 eyeballs, and they can eventually be dispelled very easily. We got a mini-boss fight with Mothula, which I'm sad to see a downgrade for Mothula, I will say. Otherwise, it's like a pretty exciting fight, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very cool fight. I just love the way Mothula looks. He's got the particles coming out, and he spits out they're called morphs, right? Little sticky
Morphs,
guys.
Yeah. That's also where we get the boomerang, which knocks those eyeballs on the door out right away. And it's really satisfying because there's a few enemies in there that can kind of trouble you, but once you get that boomerang, they're like so easy to take out. And it has that added extra functionality. It's kind of a step forward from Ocarina of Time, as like when you're aiming it, it locks onto multiple targets at once, and when you let it go, it takes them out in rapid succession. You can use it to like cut hanging vines and ropes. There's another little callback, I think, to the Great Deku Tree here, where you cut all those vines and send this large plant in the center of the dungeon crashing through the floor, you know, opening up this new segment. There are a few new gameplay features where you have to like hit switches in a specific order, you know, using that new boomerang feature.
I know you're not a big fan of the 3D boomerang in Zelda games, and I think naturally they tend to have difficulty kind of figuring out how to get that to work well. And for my money, I think this might be the best example of a 3D boomerang in a Zelda game. It just feels really fluid to me. I like that consecutive lock-on method, and it's extremely satisfying. An enemy that we've been encountering a lot, not only outside this dungeon but in this dungeon as well, are the P-hats. Until now, all that we could really do to deal with them is blow them with the Deku leaf, but now you can lock on and easily just chuck the boomerang at them, and that's a very satisfying way to get rid of those guys. Something that we've talked about in previous dungeons in the series is that feeling of kind of having obstacles in your way for a big chunk of the dungeon, and then getting the dungeon item and kind of feeling a sense of like relief or release, because now all of those eyeball doors where you get to them and you need to look around and be like, okay, what do I have at my disposal? How can I get rid of these? You don't even have to think about it anymore. You can just walk up, chuck a boomerang at them, and they're gone.
In terms of like the way you actually like kind of navigate through the dungeon, the way you like talked about those like big rooms is a great point to me, because I feel like the dungeon is more of like a series of like these very like up and down big kind of rooms, each interesting in their own way and their own individual puzzle. And the overall like dungeon navigation feels to me like very similar to Dragon Roost. Like, it's pretty straightforward, and then it has some of those, like, deviations, like, minor ones, and that are mostly, like, 90% optional, like, goodies. It's a similar criticism, I guess I would have of Dragon Roost, which is I appreciate what they're going for in the room-to-room basis. Like, the puzzles are so awesome. But I think there was just, like, a teensy, weensy, smudge, tiny bit more, maybe just, like, one little backtrack or something, like, because they do set up, you know, one of those eyeballs, for example, in one of the early rooms. And you got to warp back to that area, and then you later, you know, get the boomerang, and you do have this feeling of, oh, I can hit all those eyeballs, but like really there's only one eyeball door you got to hit, and it sort of directs you like right up to it, you know? So I think it would have been like a little more satisfying to have that.
You know, for being able to present these big open spaces where you have the freedom to kind of move about the room as you please with the deco leaf and being able to like go up and down with more freedom, I think that lends itself to more exploration. So they probably could have had a little bit more freedom in terms of like the progression of the dungeon and the navigation. But I actually kind of had the opposite feeling. I actually felt pretty satisfied because there's definitely not a lot, but something I was noticing in this dungeon more so than Dragon Roost are that there were more little hidden goodies that you had to kind of go out of your way for. There definitely could have been more exploration-based navigation as opposed to just going from one room to the next. I would say the only portion that's kind of teased at you that you can't get to first is I think it's the door that has 2 eyeballs on it.
Yes, in that big room, and that sort of is what reminds me of the Dragon Roost comparison. Because in this room, when you first come to it, there's 3 things you can't really do right away. There's a locked door, there's that double eyeball door, and there's the tree that you have to knock down with the boomerang. What this dungeon does, similar to Dragon Roost, is it keeps taking you on these paths that deviate from this room but always kind of lead back into it, and so you can take the thing that you just used and go spend it on that particular door or obstacle in that room. So even though you aren't really backtracking, you're just kind of following the loops around. It makes you feel like you are, but you really kind of have to do it in order. That's the most deviation, is you can use the boomerang on the 2 eyeballs that lead right to the boss, but you don't have the boss key, so you have to go the other way, the only other way, and then come back with the boss key. So slight openness there. I don't want to like beat a dead horse or whatever, but it sticks out to me.
Even though the navigation itself isn't particularly difficult in terms of like looking at the map, remembering where you are and remembering where you have to get to, I do like that the methods of traversal feel really diverse in this dungeon, more so than other dungeons. Like, you have rooms where you're bouncing in and out of boko buds and you're floating with the deco leaf over big gaps, and it's almost like a little platforming element there. And then you have other rooms where you need to precariously place yourself on one of those platforms and then blow yourself across. And then you have rooms where you need to almost tiptoe and be very cautious because there's those spiky vines that are popping out that could hurt you. There's one section afterwards when you're in the lower portion where you're on like a big lily pad. Correct me if I'm wrong, this might be one of the first times we see this kind of thing in the series.
The way that movement feels, it feels very like organic.
I think that's an impressive showcase again of the mechanics of the game itself. You know, we've talked about how outside you're realizing, okay, wind matters. That's even true in here with the wind that you create. They definitely could do more with it, and they will in the future. But for being the first time that we see this, I just think it's a pretty novel concept.
So after all that, we get to the final boss, Kalidamos. Who is, I don't mean to put him down, but basically it all boils down to he's a plant version of Baronade. He's this big old bulbous flower, and he's got vines that act like kind of like the tentacles. And the fight is it's very similar to Baronade, where we got to use the boomerang to disconnect the vines from the top of the ceiling, and it knocks it down, and then you got to expose his weak point and attack him. And I like he's this little baby flower inside, and he'll chew you up if you stay there too long. Otherwise, I feel like it's pretty quick and like uncomplicated fight. It might be a little trickier than the last boss, but even Baronade, I feel like had a little bit more going for it personally. Like it felt like it had more like phases and like more things happened.
I kind of like them both similarly because they are pretty similar fights. What I like, I don't think either of them are particularly difficult, but what I like about both of them is that you feel like you need to constantly be moving. You have to constantly be on your toes. You can't like stand in one spot. I like that aspect of Kalidamos more than Baronade because when you're running around, it's not like you can just hold your finger on the lock-on button and just press the boomerang whenever you're ready. I totally agree though that there could have been more, because that's literally it with this fight. You just do that a few times and then smack the
little flower guy on the inside, and that's the end of the fight.
I also do like there's a little Easter egg that you can do where
if you have an empty bottle, back when you're in Forest Haven, if you pick up a bottle of the fresh spring water, that only lasts for a certain amount of time. I can't remember how long, but if you're able to get to this boss and start fighting it before the timer on the water goes out,
if you dump the water onto Kale Demos on the little flower guy, it's a one-hit kill.
Is that intentional? Did they purposely do that? It feels like it makes perfect sense, though. You know what I mean?
Like fresh,
taking
purifying water, taking out this like evil parasite plant thing.
Yeah, I kind of almost wish every dungeon had that. Like, that would be a good mechanic to add into a game. Of like each dungeon has like a speedrun version. Afterwards, we finally get to meet and rescue Makar, who's, you know, the cutest Korok in the game. And we get to do that super cute Korok festival where they play the music. It's great. They sing. And they all fly off, and they're gonna go, seed the new world. It's kind of encouraging. Yeah, it's a great scene, for sure. With that all being said, I suppose we should do our rankings. So first, just in terms of Wind Waker, Corey, where is this dungeon for you so far on this playthrough?
Out of the ones that we've ranked so far, I would say it's pretty easily number 1.
Yeah, I'm with you too. There's been just like, for me, a nice progression of the gameplay and everything. The puzzles, like I said, the puzzles just keep getting better. And yeah, this one, I feel like Dragon Roost had a little bit better of the vibe of I feel like the straightforward navigation worked better for me in that one because it felt like I was climbing up the volcano, you know? Mm-hmm. It felt like there was like a forward momentum to it, whereas I felt more like this one was like tricking me into thinking it's a little more complex than it is.
Yeah.
But it's still the best one, I think. It's like the most fun, best puzzles. Does it go much higher on your overall list, or is it just a few spots higher, or what would you say?
Not a ton higher. What I ended up doing, it slots. So like I was saying before, the main thing about this dungeon, because I know I've always liked this dungeon, and in terms of how I feel about this dungeon compared to the other Wind Waker ones, the other ones I think have so far more stuff that I can point to and be like, I'm not as big of a fan of that, whereas this one just overall felt really solid to me. And the big thing that I was leaning on when doing my ranking is that I was impressed with the verticality of it and the verticality of the rooms and the way that the dungeon handles that. So I actually ended up placing it right around and comparing it to the Fire Temple and Snowhead Temple from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Because I feel like, and you mentioned Snowhead earlier as well, I feel like both of those have similar things where there's a good amount of verticality, they're not super complex navigationally, but there's really cool things they're doing with like what's above you and what's below you. And I ended up putting this dungeon just above Fire Temple and also above Snowhead, so it slots in right at number 20 for me. I think it was good. I think it's a really solid dungeon. There's not a ton. There's really only a few things that I can point to and say I wish this was better.
So on my list, I was thinking it's definitely, obviously, I put it above Dragon Roost. And then I definitely think it's better than the Fire Temple. I had that maybe lower than it should be, but I have it pretty low. But I did start thinking about the Deku Tree, which I think overall, like, its big hook of a puzzle, that one that's busting through the floor, I do like that better than, like, the big ideal in Forbidden Woods, just in terms of, like, trying to sell, like, a big puzzle situated in, like, one room like that. Because it had the same, like, crashing through the floor. That was, like, less satisfying to me, I guess. But I still think overall, the overall, like, puzzle progression and stuff, it's just, I thought it was a lot more fun to play. What I started comparing it to, actually, was Spirit Temple and Ganon's Castle, which to me were they're actually, like, pretty straightforward dungeons, but they offer such a, like, big feel, you know, like this, they're kind of like this big show they're putting on, you know, they're pretty epic, and it's just like, it's just really exciting being in them, even if, you know, the overall navigation or whatever is not that crazy or anything. But I thought this was even better, because I thought in those we talked about how some of the puzzles are pretty busted.
Not the best.
And so I was like, okay, I think I could put it above that. And then, I don't know, then I was sort of thinking it was a little bit harder from here, because it does kind of, I like the skull dungeon puzzles. I do think those are pretty good. I think overall what I ended up going with was putting it just below Misery Mire. So above Crown Dungeon even. I was thinking above Misery Mire, and we all know Misery Mire is like a low-key favorite of mine.
Yeah,
where, like,
wow.
if I instantly think of it, I'm like, that's like top 5. But it's not really. But that they're kind of in total opposition to each other. They're like two totally different types of dungeons, but I think they represent, they like both do what they do really well. And so I think they're both like a good representation of the games they're in.
You're comparing it to Spirit Temple and Ganon's Castle. I have those 20 spots apart on my list. But it's funny because I have Spirit Temple at number 10, and I have Ganon's Castle at number 30, and of course Forbidden Woods slotted exactly in the middle at number 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't think they're similar, but
not really, but I do get what you're saying. And I had a similar train of thought too. That is actually the first dungeon that I went to in terms of where I'm gonna put this on my list. I knew I liked it more than Dragon Roost, and then right above Dragon Roost I have Inside the Great Deku Tree. And that was the next one that naturally I was like, okay, it's clearly drawing a lot of inspiration from that one. So let me start from there. And I ended up only moving it a few more spots up.
I like how we have a similar train of thought, even though some of our opinions differ.
Yeah.
And what's funny is we both have this game ranked at 20. Or actually,
Nice.
Yeah, I have it ranked at 20 as well. So we both have it at 20, and then I guess that would make, I have Dragon Roost a little bit lower, but not by much. So we're kind of feeling the same about this, I guess, in retrospect to our lists. There's gonna be a lot more of stuff we can do in the next one, I guess, and kind of some big moments coming up. So we're gonna be doing all of the random stuff you can do as we make our way to the Tower of the Gods, I suppose. So yeah, we will see everybody in the next one.